Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll test the waters of a historical counterfactual. Could or should France have fought on in 1940? Hi, Jesse. Here we are again, another week, another podcast. This time we're moving, I would say, from where I'm based in the UK, south from where you are based at the moment, to the northwest. We're looking at France.
Indeed.
I've already said it. 1940 is, of course, the big date for France, or the big year for France in the Second World War. So, counterfactuals, we've done a few of them. Always quite good fun because you can go into anything and take any direction that you want, because this counterfactual, no one can tell you that you're wrong, which sometimes is quite good fun. So where do we start from this? Because normally what we always do is we start big, then we start to zoom in. Not quite sure if we want to do it the same with this one. I just throw the ball over to you. It's in your corner.
All right.
Where do you want to start?
Well, counterfactuals can be a slippery slope because they can lead you all over the place, and they probably allow us to give free rein to our tangent addiction that we have on the podcast. But let's throw caution to the wind.
That is dangerous.
Exactly. Let's throw caution to the wind. I say, let's see where it goes. So look, the question today is about France and, could or should they have continued to fight instead of signing the kind of armistice that they did in June 1940. Right. So I think if we can start with a principle. In principle, I think it's possible. Now we can get into some of the details of why it didn't happen or what would have happened, what could have happened if they had fought on. But in principle, it's possible because we have some other examples in the Second World War. We have Poland is maybe the primary example. There are some others. There's Norway as well. Their territory is lost. Their home territory is lost, and they evacuate whoever they can, which is basically the government plus a handful of people. The Poles may be a few tens of thousands. And they're able to, on paper at least, continue as an ally, continue the fight against Germany. And in the Polish case, as far as I know, I think they probably put more forces in the field for the rest of the war than any of the other governments in exile, at least that come to mind, in the moment. Certainly more than Norway, even though Norway had a very influential merchant marine. They had some special forces and a few other things. So in principle, France could have done it. But of course, as usual, we can open up all the different cans of what's going on in June, what's the situation on the ground, that kind of discussion. So, in principle, I think the answer is clear. It's yes. But that's not the most interesting part of the topic. The interesting part is realistically, what could we have expected? Matthias, do you want to get that ball rolling maybe? I don't know.
Yes, well, maybe before we even go there, so let's have a quick look at what happens actually during this particular campaign and all the way up to when France surrenders. And I'm not really talking about the military aspects. Don't want to do an operation one. We looked at some of these aspects in one of our episodes when we looked at the German invasion in 1940. But maybe perhaps let's talk a little bit more about the perhaps also psychological reasons that fall out of this crushing defeat, which basically result in the fact that France doesn't continue the war and doesn't continue the fight. And this whole thing about why France and how France surrendered and fell apart so quickly in 1940 is something that has really kept people, I nearly said awake at night, probably in 1940, not so much anymore, but is still being discussed and debated today, because just that sounds quite straightforward. We're used to this. Well, Germany defeats France in 1940, takes 6 weeks, and that is it. Yep, okay, that's just a matter of fact, because that's our horizon, that's our experience, that's what we've learned, that's what we know. For the people in 1940, that was fundamentally different, both for the French, their allies, but also the Germans, because let's not forget the frame of reference for these people is the First World War, which even in the German case, for the most of the First War, the longest period of that is a German-French war. The other nations are there, but they're not the main enemy. And France fights extremely well, extremely hard. And the Germans know this, and in the end, the Germans are defeated. Not only by the French, but of course, they are, as they would see it, the main part in the enemy's coalition. And then suddenly, in 1940, in 6 weeks, you basically rush through this massive army, which is in some areas stronger than the German army, and France just collapses. And that just sends shockwaves through the Western world, the Allied camp, and of course the Germans get not even mildly, but very overexcited. And you might say it's one of the reasons why you then have the downfall in Russia. Hubris sets in. If you can defeat the French army, this huge, extremely professional, good army with this great history, go back to Napoleon, go to the First World War, it takes 6 weeks to give these guys a kicking. Well, the Soviet Union, that's not an opponent, that's a victim. That's the kind of idea behind that. And when you look a little bit at the French analysis of this, even today, there's still debates. Why did France collapse so quickly? And in those days, you had actually two people who were writing about this, and they're both very interesting. And the first one is Saint-Exupéry. We all know him for The Little Prince, the book that he wrote. But of course, he was a guy in the French Air Force, and he writes about this in a book. It's called Flight to Arras, which is it's not a real story. So basically, puts together all his notes from his entire time on the front line, and out of that creates the story. And he concentrates mainly here on the military aspects. And he says, well, the way we were fighting was completely outdated, was completely wrong. It didn't work against the Germans. So this is why we had a military defeat. We got a military kicking. And he uses this picture that he creates, which is relatively famous, particularly in the French-speaking world. And so when you look at the translation, I can read this out. So he said, we had reached the last days of May 1940, a time of full retreat, of full disaster. Crew after crew was being offered up as a sacrifice. It was as if you dashed glassfuls of water into a forest fire in the hope of putting it out. We knew perfectly well there was nothing for us to go on flinging ourselves into the forest fire, an immense forest fire raging, and a hope that might be put out by the sacrifice of a few glassfuls of water. They would be sacrificed. So he keeps repeating this point. That's quite a strong picture that he paints here. And that's the feeling that the French have. They're being sacrificed. We can talk about the way the French fought maybe a little bit later on, but I know they've been talking for quite some time. So I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about another guy, and that is Marc Bloch, who wrote a book, and that's called The Strange Defeat.
First of all, he's a historian, kind of superhero in a way. I mean, he's a medieval historian who then serves in the First World War, then is called up in the Second World War, and writes this famous book, Strange Defeat. He joins the resistance later, and he's then executed by the Germans. It's been a long time since I've leafed through Strange Defeat, but in the end, from what I recall, he lays the primary responsibility on the higher command, and that they are not capable of making decisions, of being decisive, of doing the right thing. He does talk about the problems with morale in the French army, but if I remember right, his kind of conclusion puts more of the responsibility at the top, that they weren't up to it professionally or, let's say, like morally, spiritually.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I've got one or two quotes here.
Go.
We normally don't do long quotes, but I've got one here, for example, from this book. And he talks about the military leadership and the political leadership, just as you have said. And he says here, the world belongs to those who like the new. That is why, having encountered the new face to face, that basically means in the form of the German invasion, and having been incapable of dealing with it, our high command not only suffered defeat, like those boxers who have become slow due to overweight and are thrown off balance by the first unexpected blow, they accepted it. So he basically says it's the high command, they're falling apart, they don't know what to do, they don't know how to react to this, Later on, he also extends this to the political leadership. And this quite often now is also seen as one of the main reasons as to why France fell apart. It's the internal political problems that you find, all the different factions, the parties, the constantly changing governments. And when you go to any history seminar on the fall of France in 1940, this would normally be presented as the inherent reason as to why France collapsed. I personally always only find that half convincing, because even if you do have internal problems, but then you've got an outsider attacking you, isn't that time where you put all these differences to one side, at least to a degree, and fight? And I've said now a number of times, we don't really want to go too much into the tactical and operational stuff. So suffices to say that when you look at the performance of individual French units and formations, they actually do fight quite well. There are a number of examples where they counterattack, where they hold the Germans, where they put up very, very brave resistance. But in the greater scheme of things, in the strategic picture, this is not good enough, and the Germans are simply able to outmaneuver them. And that is the big problem for the French. So it's not so much the tactical fight, but particularly in the early stages, the French are actually fighting well. And that when you look at the German accounts, the Germans recognize this and they talk about this. That they experienced the typical French army. And then later on, they're really surprised themselves and shocked by the way and the speed France as a country, not only the military, but France as a country completely collapses.
Yeah, I think these are some of the factors that we have to take account of if we're going to say, could France have fought on? Should they have fought on? We can't fully get into fantasy land here. Maybe we'll dip a toe into fantasy land waters now and then over the course of the rest of this episode. But there are some kind of constraints that we should probably keep in mind. And this idea of the capabilities or lack thereof of the high command, the political issues in France are among those. For example, when you mentioned, in theory, an external enemy comes and you put aside some of your internal political differences. This was the famous watchword of 1914 in France with the so-called Union Sacrée, or in Germany with the Burgfrieden. These are just terms for basically saying we're all united now. And in France, I think one of the issues you had, of course, is that some of these political differences are quite deep ideological differences that have connections to the outside. So you have some French communists who are not that keen on making war against Germany because Germany's the ally of the Soviet Union at the time. And you have some French far-right figures who are not that keen on fighting Germany because they see Germany as, an example to be emulated in their political system and ideology, that kind of thing. So I'm oversimplifying here to some extent because there are obviously different streams of nationalism and different streams on the far left and all of that. But this is a problem when you have an ideological affinity that trumps a kind of your national loyalty, that can accelerate the collapse, and it did, I think. And it's something we need to keep in mind. So let's try to get ourselves in focus here a little bit and say, all right, what's going on in 1940 that would make it possible for them to fight on? And what maybe speaks against that in some ways, or what could limit that outcome? So I don't know. I don't know where to go with this exactly because it's so fluid. Normally, we're very focused on what we've got to do. I would say this. There's a couple of different arguments about the armistice signing. And I think we can maybe start there and try to kind of assess what goes on. So there's one sort of argument that says, well, it was the lesser evil. It allowed France to keep its empire. It allowed France to keep nominal sovereignty over its own territory, and it was only partly occupied. It allowed France to keep its fleet. And some have said, including Maxime Weygand, the former commander-in-chief, that it gave France breathing room in the future to prepare some sort of revenge or move against Germany. Spoiler alert, I don't think that argument is worth anything, but it's there. And that the honor was supposedly safe, right? So these are some of the ideas that have been batted around. Now, full disclosure, many of these ideas were promoted by Pétain and other collaborationists in the Vichy regime, right? So this is what they're trying to say they achieved by pushing this armistice. On the other side, before I throw it back to you, Matthias, on the other side, you have the idea that, no, this was essentially, and you don't save your honor, you gave up your honor by agreeing to this kind of armistice. That the war wasn't just about preserving kind of France's sovereignty on paper, even though in practice, of course, it wasn't sovereign at all. It had to do what the Germans told it to do. And it did. It wasn't just about that. It's a global struggle about ideas. It's not just a war where France has to try to preserve a semblance of honor. And if you give up, if you surrender to the enemy in that war of good versus evil, basically, you haven't achieved anything. You haven't kept your sovereignty. You haven't kept your honor. Nothing. And that's more the de Gaulle type of argument, essentially, at the time. So, those are two of the kind of more high-level approaches to should you fight on, should you not fight on. But of course, you can unpick those if you want, or you can go towards the situation on the ground and practical matters if you prefer.
I think let's spend another minute or so on the peace treaty itself, because I think it's absolutely right. You said this is of course where it all starts, and it's absolutely crucial to see what the terms are, what the conditions are, and what the you might say the story around this is. And this is where preserving the honor comes in, because the real reason, so they said in 1940, why the northern part of France had to be occupied and come under German occupation is not because that's the idea, that's the story that's being told. It's not because the Germans want to occupy France, but because they need the northern part of France to continue the fight against Britain. So that is quite clever in some ways, because it also immediately, you might say, turns the French against their former ally. Because if you say as a German, well, if the Brits make peace, well, we're off. We're not here to stay. We don't want to occupy France. We've got nothing here. We're just here because we need to fight. Open bracket. Of course, what they didn't really tell the French population, and we make you pay for the privilege of having us in your country, close bracket. So there's all sorts of really interesting political, psychological undertones when you look at this, and undercurrents here. And that's quite interesting. And that, of course, is exactly also where people like Pétain come in and say, no, okay, we surrender, but we still have our government. We still are independent. It is the, you might perhaps say, the evil British that keep fighting. Otherwise, the Germans were gone. And then
evil in quotation marks, just to be clear for all British listeners out there.
And then you look at, of course, what happens later on, the sinking of the French fleet. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So you could actually begin to see why in some areas the whole ideas and the whole tables are turning a little bit into, what's the right word? I wouldn't say into favor of the Germans, but perhaps more of a mutual understanding between the French government, which on paper, as I said, is of course independent at that particular stage. And the other thing that is really important, you already mentioned it, is this whole idea of the French Empire. So to France is more than just what you find in Europe. I mean, you've got this whole debate that goes on all the way to the 1960s, doesn't it? When you look at Algeria. Algeria is seen as part of mainland France. You still have got these overseas départements today, which are officially part of mainland France. They are, even if I'm not mistaken, on the Euro notes, because it is French territory, French Guiana and other small pieces. So to the French, this is something very, very important. And you look at, in particular, for example, to Indochina at that time, where, of course, you then have the Japanese threat developing as well. I think northern Africa is a little bit different. That's a bit more contained. And you don't really have, apart from the Italians, but they're going a different direction, you don't have a real threat to this at the moment. And again, we can talk about Operation Torch if we want to later on. But Indochina is important as well. So as long as you can keep the empire and have this idea of the French grip on these parts of the world still intact, that to the French is also extremely important. So if that means for that, in a temporary fashion, you have to give up some control of your own territory in the north, that's not particularly nice. But I think in the 1940s understanding, it still means that that France as a country still survives. And of course, you also have this experience of other wars and previous wars. To us, when we say, well, there's a peace treaty, nowadays, quite often we say, well, this is final. This will always be like this. That's not necessarily, is it or not? That's the next question. But that's not necessarily the understanding at that particular time. Go to the First World War. As Foch said, that's not the Versailles Treaty. That's not a peace treaty. It's an armistice for 20 years. And he was absolutely right. So this whole idea that fighting another war is okay, and also being occupied in inverted commas is okay, because you'll have another go at the enemy at some stage, and then you turn things around again. I mean, this is European history at that particular time. So yes, it's not particularly nice, but you've preserved France as a nation with the empire, so France still continues to, I wouldn't say thrive at this particular time.
Survive.
That would be too strong, but survive is probably the better word.
From that point of view, yes. I think it's also worth mentioning that, in hindsight, we know that Britain survives, the war continues, Germany extends the war by invading the Soviet Union, all these kinds of things. In June 1940, none of that is clear. And there's a powerful assumption that many are making in France, and not only in France, that Germany had won the war as it existed at that time, and that the UK would soon be beaten. And so why bother fighting on? However, I think, strategically, there are some interesting arguments that the armistice essentially was a kind of a mistake. This is an argument made in a book chapter that I just read in a collective work by some historians from France. And they basically say, look, if we want to assess the armistice that they did sign, let's look at its impact, right? So is it really preserving France for something, or, as they essentially conclude, that it's militarily, diplomatically, strategically, that it gives everything to the Germans. So, for example, it saves the Germans a ton of resources because they don't have to occupy all of France and all of the North African Empire. That's being done for them by a collaborationist regime. And that collaborationist regime denies those assets and their resources to Germany's remaining enemy, the UK, right? Same goes for the fleet. The French fleet is essentially neutralized from the German point of view. That's not going to be used against them. And it creates a problem for the British because they are not sure, of course, whether the fleet might be used against them at some point in the future, which leads to them attacking it, as you mentioned. If there had been a French government in exile, be it in the UK or in North Africa, that means that France's sovereignty goes with them, and that Germany then can't influence France to the same extent. They can still occupy it, they can still repress the resistance that's there, but it's not the same thing. There might have been more resistance. Now we're starting to sprinkle in little counterfactuals. And as you mentioned, this also creates this rift with the British, which is significant, and that's to Germany's advantage. One might say that by choosing Pétain as their main collaborator-in-chief, or accepting him, let's say, because he offered, let's be a little more accurate, that his prestige and his argument about, the nation, and I can represent the nation because I saved us at Verdun, which is a semi-myth, but anyway, in 1916, that might have even weakened French resistance, for example, against the Germans. So that's another advantage. It has a huge impact in the Mediterranean, right? As well, because what do the Italians do? They join the war late. Then they're free to attack the British in Egypt. Whereas if the French North African and West African Empire had still been active in the war, the Italians would have had to watch their other colonial borders and might not be able to do that. And in terms of France's prestige and honor, at the peace table at the end of the war, signing an armistice like this, leaving the war, it really weakens France's position in the post-war order. There's a little hindsight there, because if the assumption is that the UK is going to lose and Germany's going to win, then collaborating with Germany may strengthen your hand in the post-war order, but as it turned out, it weakened France's hand in the post-war order. And essentially, thanks to de Gaulle, they were able to have any role at all at the end of the war and occupying Germany. Because if he hadn't done what he did, as much as he was annoying to the British and Americans on many occasions, if he hadn't done that, France's honor and prestige would have been much less at the end of the war because of the type of armistice that they signed. So that was my rant on the armistice, thanks to Jean Lopez and Olivier Vivorca and their book. Matthias, what do you think?
Well, I think the first thing is when you jump forward to 1945 and the role of France and all this, there is this I would say beautiful, forgive me French people listening now, this beautiful scene where on the evening of the 8th of May 1945, the German delegation is marched into the former engineers school building in Karlshorst in Berlin to sign the unconditional surrender. And Keitel, the head of the OKW, arrives and he sees the delegation there, the Allied delegation, and of course there's the Brits there, and there's the Americans there, and then there's the Soviets there. And then he just sees the fourth person standing there, and he just looks at them, looks up and down. That's of course it's the French general, and he turns to his aide-de-camp next to side and said, "Oh, I didn't know they defeated us as well." So there's this thing, because everybody knows realistically, France is not a victorious power in 1945. It is for historical reasons. It's for historical reasons that they're invited. They are defeated in 1940 and are basically taken out. So everything that happens afterwards, of course, is a lot of, well, let's recreate the idea of la grande nation, and France needs to be up there. But actually, they're utterly defeated and beaten in 1940. And without the help of the other nations, France would not be where it is in 1945, which is probably, potentially, also why you find a little bit of a chip on the national shoulder even today. Most nations have chips on their shoulders for different reasons, all sorts of reasons, and I think this is probably the French reason when you look at that. So that's interesting. And it's also interesting if we just open another can of worms just to get another idea.
That's what this episode's all about.
That's exactly. I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but because you talked about these, it's the legal and constitutional issue, isn't it? You surrender. What does that mean? What does that mean for this funny chap de Gaulle, who goes to France and kind of claims that he is now the real France and continues to fight? So how does that go hand in hand with Pétain and all the other people? There is an interesting other example, and that's Belgium at that particular stage, because they get kind of, you might say, halfway house. So you got Poland, you mentioned it, they officially continue the war. Other nations do the same thing. How influential, important that really is for the outcome of the war is another question. It's politically very important. It's important for the feeling of these particular nations. That's very, very important. But the Polish army in exile, even that, and you said it's the biggest army, did not decide the outcome of the Second World War. It's important for what happens afterwards and political reasons and all these things. And then you get France, and they're basically just out. Belgium is interesting because Belgium is halfway. So Belgium surrenders in 1940 after, I think it's a couple of days. Was it? No, how long is Belgium? It's 2 weeks, isn't it? If I'm not mistaken.
I think it's 2 weeks.
Is that right?
I think it's late May.
Yeah. And so the government then goes into exile as well. And they say, no, we're continuing the fight. The king, Leopold III, he stays and he surrenders. His argument being, no, I need to be here because my people are here and my soldiers are surrendering. I need to be with my people and my soldiers, which I think is actually a reasonably good reason to stay, you might say. You talked about Norway. Other people see it differently. We need to continue the fight. I actually think it's an honorable thing if that's the real reason. However, that's held against him during the war and also after the war. And as a consequence, cut a very long story short, he's then forced to abdicate in the 1950s because they say, well, you didn't continue the fight. He even went to meet Hitler in 1940, in the autumn of 1940 in Berchtesgaden, where apparently they were talking about releasing prisoners and the role of Belgium in this greater German empire. And he gets a lot of flack for that because people say you got into bed with Hitler. There's actually an interesting account by the German interpreter, he says, no, that's not true. He was very anti-Hitler. He was very socially awkward and inept as well, very clumsy, but he made his point and he was very anti-Hitler, and that talk didn't go anywhere. But so you can also see there, of course, internal Belgian issues here, so you can use this against the king and all these things. But here you've got a halfway house where, say, one side's trying to continue the war and the other side isn't, which is, again, makes the whole thing even more complex and difficult. And the last point before I throw it back to you is, and you've mentioned this, I just want to re-emphasize this. I think we really need to be careful, and that's what we all do all the time. When we look at situations, we always look at it with the benefit of hindsight. We know that what happened in 1941, you mentioned it, Germany invades the Soviet Union, 1945, the war comes to an end, all these things. In 1940, no one knows this. In 1940, as you said, Germany is the master of Europe. And wouldn't it be quite foolish for anybody, including French people, to say, no, we're very heroically, we're going to continue the fight from somewhere. I mean, what is it that you are achieving? And this, when you got people like Pétain, who of course later on put on trial, he was sentenced to death by the French state. Then, of course, that was overturned because of his achievements in the First World War. But he is not a pro-German. He doesn't want to get into bed with the Nazis at that particular stage. Why does he do that? Because he thinks he is helping some sort of French state to survive. I mean, if he was really, really utterly pro-German, and that was ingrained, he wouldn't have fought the Germans at, for example, as you mentioned, Verdun. It's very tough decisions. And perhaps it's a bit easier to understand if you look at other nations. Again, I mean, look at Germany in the end of the First World War. It's the same debate. Do we make peace? Do we not make peace? What is it that we can achieve? What can't be achieved? The Versailles Treaty leads to all sorts of issues afterwards. You find that. But at that particular moment in time, what else is it that you can do? Yes, it's preserving honor, and that is great. And that's easy for someone like de Gaulle to say, and he then just buggers off and goes to Britain, where he just annoys people for the next few years, to be perfectly honest. But you might perhaps say, and that's a very controversial statement now. So, dear listeners and viewers, just comment on that in a nice way. So, in some ways, people like Pétain who do this, accept this very, very harsh fate, are perhaps more of a patriot than de Gaulle.
Ooh.
Because they are trying to keep that's a good one, isn't it? That's a good one. I can see the comments coming in. Oh,
I will have to take some
Jesse's getting excited.
Yeah.
If you're not watching this and you're just listening to this, I could see Jesse getting very uneasy in his chair here. So I need to keep talking for another 5 minutes. Otherwise he's just going to have a massive burst at me. It's just to get the discussion going. But you know what I mean by this. In some ways, are they the greater patriots? Yes or not? I don't know what you're going to say now. I'm throwing it back to you, Jesse. Hit me. Hit me.
I mean, yeah, I don't see it that way, hindsight or no. And there were a lot of Frenchmen who didn't see it that way at the time. Certainly, that was, and I'm not saying you're taking a Vichyite line here, strictly speaking, but that was kind of the thinking of the Vichy regime, right?
Absolutely.
And of Pétain, what he was saying. Ideologically, he is a bit muddy. Of course, in 1916, he's firmly anti-German. He's fighting a bitter war against them, and he's convinced. But 24 years later, there's a different ideological landscape. And I think that he and some others felt perhaps that Germany and German occupation and dominance is the lesser evil compared to potential communist revolution in France as they saw it, as they perceived that danger. So I think ideologically he is a bit of a mixed figure, to say the very least. However, I think if we go by, let's say, I wanted to say a normal definition of patriotism, but that's a tough thing to say. I think it's hard for me to accept the idea that surrendering to that Germany is more patriotic than trying to continue the struggle. And that's an ideological statement as well, right? So just to be fully transparent, right? There are some times where maybe you can lose with honor and surrender with honor, and sometimes where I think it's very hard to do. Now, maybe there's some hindsight in that too, because the degree of German crimes, Holocaust, moral depravity was not as extreme in some ways in 1940 as it would become later in the war. Of course, all the elements were there, ideological and concentration camps and killing prisoners of war and handicapped people and all of that. But it wasn't to the extent of what we know now. So there is a caveat there as well. However, one aspect, I want to shift gears here. I've had my little riposte, I guess, about
that was very much. I was expecting a full broadside.
No, I definitely.
Here, so
okay. Let me reinforce that. I think he felt in his own, let's say, twisted way that he was being patriotic, that all was lost, and this was the most patriotic thing to do. But I think in general, I would come down on the side of he harmed his country far, far, far more than he helped it. Whether you look at it from honor or future influence or what have you. And I do think it was this is also a bit harsh, I think, but I do think it can be considered a treasonous act in a way. Because it wasn't just, okay, France leaves the war and then is neutral. It's France becomes an accomplice to Germany. I think that's what tips me over the edge, you see? If France had really been out of it, no occupation, no resources given to Germany. I mean, they freely gave French citizens for forced labor, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So if they'd really come out of it, then I think I would see more the argument of, well, yeah, lesser evil. But no, they became a client state, essentially, of Germany. And I guess that's what pushes me over the edge. So there we have it. However, I want to shift gears now because I read a very interesting scenario where what could have happened if France decided to continue the fight, right? And I think that's interesting. Now we're getting into real, fictional counterfactuals. But of course, I'll give a small caveat before. There are a lot of practical difficulties for them to continue the fight, not only political and ideological, but very practical ones. Their army is a mess, right? In June 1944, it's not really functioning. Yes, there are individual pockets of resistance, but command and control is on the way to breaking down. Morale has broken down largely. The Germans are driving into southern France. And I don't mean driving like pushing as a military offensive. I mean driving like, well, I guess tanks don't necessarily have steering wheels, but you know what I mean. Just moving without, in many places, with very limited resistance. So the idea is not that France, and of course the French Air Force was on the edge of not being functional at all anymore. So the idea is not that France would somehow reestablish a front line anywhere in France. The idea that I thought was interesting is that, okay, Paul Reynaud, the premier who wanted to continue the war, he gets more backing and decides to do it and doesn't basically listen to Pétain. So what can he do then? You fight as long as you can, rearguard actions in France to delay things, assuming your troops are still willing to fight. It's another big assumption. And you evacuate everything that you can to North Africa. So that means as many troops as you can, as many experts, specialists, as much heavy equipment as you can, as much machine tools, maybe for factories, as you can, as much government apparatus as you can in order to keep that sovereignty and have some sort of functioning state and government in exile. And that then you can have a potential scenario where France is able to, in some way, continue the war from its empire, as Churchill had sworn to do for the British. I think that's another useful comparison is, there is the example that Britain said, we will do that. Now, they didn't have to put that to the test, but they made plans for that. The French, by the way, didn't have these plans to fight on from North Africa. That's another problem. If you don't have a plan, you got to put one together in a couple of weeks. It's not going to be pretty. Anyway, that was my setup for what would then happen. It's so easy to poke holes in that, Matthias. Just have a field day.
But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? It's probably the best plan, the best idea, the best option there, because you know that the mainland is lost. I mean, where do you go then? Corsica, okay, you can do that, but in that case, well, go all the way to North Africa. That makes sense. And also, as we've already said previously, because in the French understanding, particularly Algeria, is not just a colony; it's more than that. So you might even say you continue to fight from the home territory,
Another
so
part of France, yeah.
Another part of France, exactly. And that's also reflected in the original deployment of the French force in 1939, also 1940. You have relatively strong reserves there when the war breaks out. Also in May 1940, when the Germans attack, there's a strong Air Force contingent, for example. There's, of course, operational reasons as well, because they want to refight the First World War. They assume it's going to be a long war, so you need to have the reserves back. With the benefit of hindsight, you might say, again, perhaps foolishly, of course, they would have seen this very differently, moved all these assets to France. So again, benefit of hindsight, wouldn't have been better to keep these forces back and then continue the fight from North Africa. Yes, you can look at this. Is this a feasible option? Well, the French they actually, of course, do fight in North Africa as well. And that's, of course, Operation Torch, 1942. And now we're back to your point. So it's not only are the French, they're not just out of the war, but they're actually taking the other side, because there's fighting between the Vichy troops and the Allied troops as they land in North Africa. And that, of course, also the reason why the Germans then say, now we're going to occupy everything in later 1942, because they say, you're not fighting hard enough. We thought you were better allies than you really are, so you're all out. And from that moment onwards, Germany occupies all of France. But that's a different story. But you can see it can be done. And if you've moved even more troops over there, there is an argument that it could have established a relative strong base. And then look at the other side. What are the others doing? Well, you've got the Italians. They will be struggling to do other things, having a big French contingent in their rear. The French army also gave the Italians very hard time in the later stages of the campaign in 1940. So you can kind of see and expect where a struggle between these two armies would go. You have the Germans, who really are not that interested in North Africa. The Africa Corps only sent there to support the Italians. Hitler's looking to the east. You still, in that case, have the Navy. And I mean, that is the interesting one, isn't it? Having the Navy, because, well, the French Navy is really, really strong. And as you said, the main worry for the British when the treaty is signed, the peace treaty, is what is happening to the French fleet, because it's a modern fleet, it's a really strong fleet. If you continue to use that, you're giving the Italians an extremely hard time in the Mediterranean. French fleet combined with the British fleet, German fleet is non-existent. How do you then get the Africa Corps transported to North Africa if you want to do this? By air, as they try in 1943, that's not going to be enough. So you can see all sorts of really interesting, pure military, but also political repercussions this would have had. And it's not to say that would have been a very, very bad idea. It would have been bad for mainland France. That would have been given a very different peace treaty. But everything that you said earlier, it's also about the honor, it's continuing the fight. That, you might say, would have made sense. I just come back to the point that I've now made a number of times. I think this is very much, from my point of view, very much an argument with the benefit of hindsight. In 1940, if you're a French statesman, I think this is, yes, it's an option, but you've just been defeated in the field. You've got a navy which is still very, very good. It's strong. It's there. You can control the Mediterranean. But what are your hopes of getting back from North Africa into proper mainland France and fight your way back? I think these are things we need to take into consideration as well. It's very easy to always say, all these people in the past, they were all idiots. They didn't know what they were doing. They're not. And that most of them are decent people, and they're trying to achieve the best for their country. As we now discuss, sometimes maybe not, and you've got these political issues and all that. So at that moment in time, is that really a feasible option, yes or no? Looking at the political landscape, dubious. Of course, you don't know what's happening. If you go there, if you go there and continue the fight, you are the big hero in 1945. In 1940, no one sees this. Because you also don't have that strong support. I mean, it's very different if you go to 1941, as you said. Germany's invaded the Soviet Union. Late 1941, America is in the war. I mean, 1940, let's face it, well, France is beaten, Britain is beaten. The BF is pushed into the channel. Britain has got nothing to go for at that particular stage. If you're a Frenchman, you say, well, I wouldn't trust the Brits to come back. Opening bracket, this feeling that the British betrayed the French anyway in northern France, and when you look at Dunkirk and all these things, can you rely on these people? So where is an ally that you can trust? Very different a year later. Very, very, very different. And I can imagine that a lot of French people were kicking themselves in 1941, 1942. I thought, whoopsie, if we'd known this, we'd done things a bit differently.
Probably,
but
yes.
There we are.
Probably, yes. Of course, the British government and Churchill did make a bet that the war would go that way eventually.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't know at the time whether it would or not, but, Churchill's, we're going to hold out until the new world comes and saves the old. So there were those ideas, but he was considered, I think, an outlier in many ways.
Well, it's also interesting because it's easy to talk about this, but Britain was never invaded. It would have been interesting to put this to the test. We talked about this, didn't we? We had an episode on Sea Lion. What the actual outcome of this would have been. It's great to talk about this because we can do this and we continue the fight. You've got a channel in between and the Germans don't come. Would have been really interesting to see what would have happened if the Germans had invaded. But that's another
topic.
Big
yes.
If. Oh my God, so many what ifs. Yes.
I have more what ifs about France though. If we'll indulge me a little bit, I thought there were some interesting points in the stuff that I had read. One point that came to me though about the delaying action, a potential delaying action on the mainland of France in order to, give themselves more resources and a better hope for fighting on to evacuate more stuff. The German army, yes, they defeat the French very quickly, but that papers over some issues. And we talked about this in some of our previous episodes about the French campaign. They're at the end of their logistical rope, essentially. They're running short on ammunition of different kinds because the factories are not producing enough in Germany. So that might have allowed the French to hold out for longer in the south, for the Germans to be able to bring up enough force and reorganize to fully capture the French home territory, metropolitan France. Also, if we look at the evacuation at Dunkirk, within a very short period, they were able to evacuate, 330,000 plus men. And then the Brits did another kind of mini Dunkirk once the Germans broke through again later into the rest of France, where they took off another 200,000 or so men within a short period of time. So I'm not saying they could have rescued the 2 million men in the French army and brought them to North Africa, but who knows? They could have potentially rescued, with British help, a fairly substantial force, certainly much more substantial than the Polish forces that ended up fighting on the Allied side. And as you mentioned, of course, they make an important but numerically limited contribution on the Allied side. The French forces that could have been evacuated potentially could have been much more substantial and would have been very welcome, the ones who made it to the UK, to bolster the weak British army in the face of potential invasion. So if all this had worked, you have some knockoffs. You talked about the Mediterranean a little bit and North Africa a little bit, where the Italians, maybe they can't attack the British in Egypt, or the fleet will prevent the Italians from supplying their colony in Libya, maybe prevent the Germans from sending the Africa Corps. Maybe the Allies would have been able to take all the Italian colonies. I mean, they did in East Africa anyway fairly easily. And Libya was probably not the toughest nut to crack if they had been able to, the Allies, have naval dominance in the Mediterranean. And then you have quite a significant base that is safe for air operations, for later invasions of the Balkans or Sicily or whatever. I know I'm going off on massive tangents, but that's what this kind of episode is for. This might have meant as well that the Battle of Britain could have been delayed. If the Germans have a harder time or take longer to get control of metropolitan France, maybe the Battle of Britain is delayed, which means that the British would have that much more time to prepare, which means that the fall weather would play a bigger role in the crucial period of the battle, and the British victory might have come, at a lower cost to them. The French Navy could have helped with the Battle of the Atlantic as well. So, that might have also shifted something in the war. And finally, I think there's the question of U.S. support, because of course the French are not going to be able to manufacture anything in this scenario. They're not going to be producing, all sorts of aircraft and tanks and whatever else. But there's an interesting book by Michael Nyberg where he talks a little bit about the U.S. policy towards France in the lead up to 1940 and how important France was for the U.S. concept of global security and U.S. security. That France is like the main resistance to all these dangerous ideas in Europe of fascism and communism and so on. And the US had planned to give more support to France if France had held out. So what they ended up giving to Britain, the idea is that potentially they would have been able to support France in a similar way. So whatever exiled French army there could have been in several Dunkirk-style evacuations from the south and maybe from the Bay of Biscay on the Atlantic, or maybe even from Normandy or Brittany, depending on how things shook down. Let's say you have 500,000 men. They could be equipped by Lend-Lease from the US and be a substantial force. I mean, 500,000 men is not nothing when you look at what Britain had available at the time. It's quite a significant piece in 1940 or even 1941, 42. So I think those are some of the little hints of where our imagination can take us. I don't know. You have any thoughts on those?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about logistics, but you already talked about this, and I think that's the point you must never forget is, you just evacuate to North Africa and you've got an army sitting there. Well, that's brilliant, but what do they have? Because you've lost all your industrial output, and that simply wouldn't work unless you find someone to continue to support you. And you already said who that particular person would be, because again, in 1940, Britain is in no state and is not able to send more troops or ammunition or equipment to another nation. The British Army's just been defeated in the field, so they've got nothing left. That's basically it. And when you look at the situation of the British Army at that particular time, it is really, really quite dire. But we talked about this in the other episodes on France 1940, and also the one on the German planning of invasion, so up sea line, so we can park that thought. But I think that's really important, just again to stress this, that we really need to understand that this is 1940 we're looking at. We're not really talking about 1941, 1942, 1943. And yes, you've got this American influence there. That, of course, is very true. Long-standing link, actually, in many ways, between the US and France. You might say up to perhaps the end of the Second World War. In many ways, the special relationship is more the US and France than the US and Britain. You can still see this today. Look at the political system. Look at the military structure. Look at all sorts, particularly in the military realm. There's a lot of French influence on the US, in particular, of course, the US Army, that you can still very, very clearly see today. So that's an interesting one.
Well, I mean, France was a decisive factor in the Revolutionary War. So,
exactly. Absolutely.
But go on.
There we go. Absolutely. Yep. One thing we haven't really talked about, maybe we shift focus a little bit again away from the North African bit to the wider empire, because we talked about the empire, but what does that actually mean? Assumption, guess, not quite sure. Potentially the colonies in Africa would remain under some sort of French control, I'm guessing, just because of where they are geographically. It's a bit difficult to get to most of them for Italy, for example, West Africa. Probably still a very different story when you go to the east, Indochina, i.e., roughly speaking, modern-day Vietnam. That would still have fallen under the Japanese. But, and here's another thing that is quite interesting, again, when you jump forward and you go into this period of decolonization, I mean, one of the reasons why all these colonies decided to want and fight for independence after World War II is because they'd seen that the white man can be defeated. You go to the Far East, so that's in inverted commas the worst. You've got the white French people defeated by Japanese. I mean, that sends all the wrong signals to the people in that part of the world, particularly the French guys living there. So how can this happen? what's going to happen when the war's over? They come back, they say, we want to have our colony back. And the people say, that's not happening. Thank you very much. We want to be independent now. Perhaps not so much change in the Far East because you have the Japanese going there anyway, but potentially there's another big what if. The history of, in particular, West Africa from a French point of view might have turned out differently. If that had remained under French control the whole time, and now I don't mean because that officially comes under Vichy again, so that's what Vichy controls. And again, you can make this argument, what's the Vichy link, supporting the Germans, all these things. If you say, no, we're basically still fighting for France and we're continuing the fight, that sends another message. So it's another big what if, and we don't really know, but I think to the French people, even today, that is still something that is quite important. That is what people in the UK and some other countries understand. Most people in continental Europe don't really get this because they don't have the colonial history. So in Germany, probably Poland, Hungary, people don't think that much about Africa or other places in the world because that's too far away. I think that's very different in other nations, particularly also and including France.
Yes, I mean, Germany did have some African colonies, but obviously not quite the same, not near the same extent or length of interaction and control there. Right.
It's not in the national DNA, the colonial history. Very different.
Not the same way. It depends who you ask, obviously.
Not the same
some
way.
people have focused quite a bit on colonial atrocities in Namibia, that sort of thing. But yes, it's obviously not comparable. It's obviously not comparable. Yeah, that's true. So, shall we wrap it up for today, Matthias, then? Have we fantasized to our heart's content about a grand French resistance plan?
It was just bizarre because we were saying at the very beginning when we're going to go all sorts of different tangents and let our minds roam and wander. I'm not quite sure, for some strange reasons, I had some UFO coming down onto France with some sort of furry animals wearing French uniforms and lasering away all the... So that's taking a bit too far. So maybe it's time to wrap it up here. So it's otherwise, I'm not quite sure what's happening
Musings
to my mind.
of the German imagination. All right. Well, folks, that was our little trip into the counterfactual about could or should France have fought on in the Second World War. I think the summary, I would say, if you allow, Matthias, is essentially they could have, but saying they should have, if we take away the overwhelming influence of hindsight, it's a very muddy waters, and it's much harder to say they should have or shouldn't have, given the conditions in 1940. But they could have. So that's where we'll leave it for today. We'll let your imaginations out there, listeners and viewers, do the rest. Thanks a lot for listening and watching. If you would like to support the podcast, by the way, of course, we'd be very happy if you chose to do that. You can do that by going to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even get a free month trial access to our exclusive content on our website in the War Room if you use the code word Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you there. And otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Jetzt nehmen wir auf.
Jetzt haben wir es.
Ist erledigt.
Das hilft.
Kannst dir vorstellen?
Großartig.
Whoops.
Herrlich. Whoopsie.